So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I see that people who are listening in very different parts of the world. It's a real pleasure to host you for another virtual meeting. So welcome for this 5th conference of our Beyond Memory online program. After having listened fascinating presentation of Andrzej Umański 2 weeks ago about the persecutions of homosexuals in Germany during the Nazi regime, but also in decades after World War II. Today we will have the opportunity to discuss another very actual issue, the question of contemporary anti-Semitism. As you know, Yahad Inunum is an organization which is leading investigation about the mass executions of Jews in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. We are interviewing the non-Jewish neighbors who are witnesses of the shootings of their Jewish neighbors. We are reconstructing the circumstances of the crime. We are rebuilding the crime scene. In fact, we are gathering the evidence, the proofs of the genocide. And doing this investigation, we are fighting against Holocaust denial and, of course, in a larger sense, against anti-Semitism. In a time where anti-Semitic violences are on a daily basis in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in America, in a time where the anti-Semitism kills people almost 80 years after the Holocaust, we feel the duty, the necessity to organize a conference around the topic of the question of anti-Semitism today with 2 prominent specialists of the question. The conference of today will be entitled Contemporary Anti-Semitism 75 Years After World War II, and we will have the opportunity to listen Avi Abraham Benlolo and Father Desbois. And I'm letting you, Marco, now introduce our speakers, especially Avi Benlolo, who is new on this program of conference. And we are very grateful to Avi and to Father Desbois for having accepted to take part in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Michal. First of all, I must say that Avi has been a friend to Father Desbois and Yahad Inunum for years. He is a Canadian human rights activist and the former president and chief executive officer of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. As well as reading for newspapers in Canada, Benlolo is regularly interviewed and cited by media in print, on radio, and television. He speaks on a variety of issues related to tolerance, justice, and human rights. He has worked with international, national, and local communities and business leaders, including Mikhail Gorbachev and King Abdullah II, as well as Canadian leaders, including General Romeo Dallaire, local mayors and chief of police, federal members of parliament, and the Prime Minister of Canada. It is an honor for me as director of Yahad Inunum to welcome in our online program Beyond Memory, Avi Benlolo, on a conversation with Father Patrick Desbois about the contemporary anti-Semitism, 75 years after World War II. Avi, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Marco, for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me okay. Firstly,
yes.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, to be speaking with you today. Thank you, Father Patrick Desbois and Marco Gonzalez for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be talking to Yahad Inunum and this important organization. I have to say how impressed I am with the important work that you are doing in terms of Holocaust research, of investigation, of your work in Iraq, your work in Guatemala. It's truly God's work, what you're doing, and I'm always impressed with it, and I have been for years. You're trying to make the world a better place, and that's what we should all be striving to do. So thank you very much for allowing me today to speak about anti-Semitism. So I will first, my talk, I understand I have about 20-25 minutes. If I'm going too long or too short, you can interrupt me. I think there's several components to discussing anti-Semitism. The first one is we have to define anti-Semitism, which is one of the biggest issues of our day. So we'll talk briefly about how to define or defining anti-Semitism according to global norms today. And then we'll talk about three particular streams of anti-Semitism that we're dealing with today in contemporary anti-Semitism. And then we can have some questions and answers. So I've taken some notes, and I hope that without further ado, you'll allow me to first focus on defining anti-Semitism. And of course, anti-Semitism and its definition, it really depends on who you ask. So I looked at two particular areas. And the first one, of course, is the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And this agency has been working prolifically at, trying to combat anti-Semitism, and it's only become a new thing for this particular agency. And I'm going to show you the differentiation between how the EU sees anti-Semitism and how now mostly the rest of the world sees anti-Semitism. And you're going to see this in 1 second. So the EU's definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm going to read it to you, is anti-Semitism can be expressed in the form of verbal and physical attacks, threats, harassment, discrimination, and unequal treatment, property damage, and graffiti or other forms of speech or text, including on the internet. Anti-Semitic incidents and hate crimes violate fundamental rights, especially the right to human dignity, the right to equality of treatment, and the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So that is the basic definition from the EU of anti-Semitism. Now, the question is, how does that differentiate from what is now becoming an accepted form of definition of anti-Semitism? Now, I say this accepted because a number of years ago, an organization called the International Human Rights Alliance, Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, was formed. And it's now become a more prolific organization, and it's tried to create a working definition of anti-Semitism. The issue with anti-Semitism, as we all know today, is it's bound by contemporary issues, mostly relating to Israel. So, whereas in the past, of course, before 1948, we didn't have the modern state of Israel, anti-Semitism was something completely different. Now we're dealing with what we are calling the new form of anti-Semitism, which is inherently tied to the state of Israel. And so the IHRA definition is a little bit more comprehensive, yet interestingly enough, presents more problems for anti-Semitic groups. And that's part of what we're going to discuss here today. So let me first of all read to you a little bit about the IHRA definition. Its first premise is, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institution, and religious facilities." Now, you might say that that sounds almost like the EU definition, but let me go a little bit further, and then they break it down, which is very helpful. So here are some examples of contemporary anti-Semitism as now adopted by probably about 37 nations around the world, and almost on a weekly basis by various municipalities, states, provinces, even here in Canada. The province of Ontario, which is where I live, just 2 weeks ago adopted this definition, which is a very big thing. We're talking about a province of over 10 million people. So part of the examples that the IHRA definition provides is the following: accusing the Jews as people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Example, by claiming that, and this is important, this one here is important, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. That is anti-Semitism. applying double standards by requiring of its behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. It's anti-Semitism. Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, which I know everyone here would understand, claims of Jews killing Jesus, or the blood libel, protocols of the elders of Zion, the usual libels to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis, as we often see, and holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. So this is important because, when we're talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, we're talking really about how anti-Semitism today is intertwined with the state of Israel. And that's critical for what I'm about to say to you next. And that is really a core definition that has now been globally and is being globally accepted. And it is very, very important. About 10 years ago, it wasn't there. And I recall hosting, in fact, one of the first IHRA meetings here in Toronto, and I invited the chairman of the IHRA, and I said to him at that time, I said, look, it would be important for you to include Israel in the definition of anti-Semitism, because this is what's happening, especially from the radical left-wing movement on university campuses, for example. Anti-Semitism now has been bound up with the state of Israel. So I want to go a little bit deeper into that. And so this is, of course, has caused the anti-Israel radical left movement much problems, this definition that we're seeing today. Because what they want to be able to do is they want to criticize Israel without being called anti-Semitic. They insist on, in quotes, free speech as their right to express themselves, even while the rest of the world says that by defaming, delegitimizing, and dehumanizing the Jewish state, they are in fact practicing anti-Semitism. And therefore, anti-Israel groups effectively practice a double standard by relentlessly pursuing Israel, criticizing it unfairly for human rights issues, and demanding justice for Palestinians only, without equally criticizing other nations. And we know other nations, of course, whether it be Iran that, persecutes homosexuals and women, North Korea with the various internment camps, China now with, we know with the internment and concentration camps of Uyghurs, and even the Tibetans, and Venezuela and other nations, we know the human rights abuses in those countries, and of course what's taken place in Syria. But yet none of those countries get as much contempt and abuse by international bodies, for example, the United Nations, the United Nations Human Rights Council, as does Israel. And for this reason, it's anti-Semitic. And we know that Israel is the most pluralistic and welcoming country in the Middle East. In fact, I just want to point out, not in my notes here, but MasterCard yesterday holds an annual index of rights and freedoms. And so yesterday it released a report that it found that women entrepreneurs in Israel, it ranked women entrepreneurs in Israel as #1 in the world in terms of an ability of empowerment and operating businesses and being able to do so. And so Israel is one of the most prolific and pluralistic countries in the Middle East, if not in the world. Israel, of course, is imperfect. For all of you who out there, yes, Israel has a lot of problems, of course, like many countries. There are many social problems. But even with all of this in mind, there are Arab parliamentarians in the Israeli Knesset. There are Arab professionals practicing in civil service as diplomats, as police officers, as corporate leaders. Nowhere in the Middle East do you see this kind of integration, continued movement towards equality, diversity, and human rights. And in Israel, minority groups enjoy freedom and democracy, not dissimilar to the majority of Western nations. Is there inequity? Of course, there's inequity in Israel. There's, as I said, there's problems that need to be solved. Do minority groups have rightful claims to discrimination? Yes, of course. But this is work in progress, as it is in every nation. Even here in my own country, in Canada, you know, we have issues with respect to discrimination against the Indigenous community. And this is continuously something in dialogue, but you don't hear international condemnations and hatred targeted towards Canadians. You don't hear condemnations at the United Nations targeted at Canada, despite the various inequities and things that happen in my own country, as happen in many other countries. So the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, therefore, correctly argues that because Israel is the embodiment of the Jewish people, and because anti-Semitism continues to change, and it really does change depending on the time, the place, you know, the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust was different than the anti-Semitism of today. But the anti-Semitism of today, of course, is an outgrowth of the Holocaust, of the Nazi ideology, which is being refined and refabricated. And that destructive behavior towards the state of Israel is an anti-Semitic endeavor. Thus, for example, the radical left has gone on a campaign to try and redefine anti-Semitism. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting. And I want to draw to you a real life example. So as we speak and as we're sitting here today, there's an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace. And I say this in quote, it's called Jewish Voice for Peace, but it's anything but that. And it's planning, it announced just the other day that it's planning a discussion next month that's entitled Dismantling Anti-Semitism, Winning Justice. Strange title, and the panelists themselves, the panelists that are sitting on this discussion are themselves having been critical of the state of Israel. And this organization, JVP, says, come hear the speakers, and I'm not naming the speakers here, you can look them up yourselves, discuss how to fight anti-Semitism and how to fight back against false allegations, false charges of anti-Semitism that seek to undermine progressive movements for justice. So what's happening here? Well, the people that want to denounce Israel, their problem is that IHRA is saying they're anti-Semitic because it's tied to anti-Semitism, which is correct. And so they're finding this challenging. They're finding the ability to try to destroy, disrupt, dismantle, delegitimize Israel as the embodiment of the Jewish people, a challenge to do in this day and age. And so they're trying to actually, as they say in their own words, dismantle the definitions of anti-Semitism. And so what these so-called experts are attempting to do in their own words is, again, dismantle the concept of anti-Semitism and turn the concept of social justice itself on its head by claiming that the current definition is an illegitimate project, as is the state of Israel itself. And thus, is it any wonder that what we have been seeing is this growth of anti-Semitism on the university campuses and the so-called intellectual circles, you know, whether they be unions around the world as an example, or various church groups, you know, that are all promoting these variations of anti-Semitisms. And despite the movement towards peace in the Middle East, like the Abraham Accords that we're seeing now today in the Middle East between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, the radical left is continuing to promote, for example, the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign, which is now being deemed as anti-Semitic and by definition of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, BDS is an anti-Semitic campaign. Most countries, especially Western countries, have now obviously condemned BDS, calling it anti-Semitism, including my own government here in Canada. And worse, that these radical left-wing groups that want to dismantle the state of Israel, for the last nearly 20 years, they've been calling Israel an apartheid state. And of course, this is nothing more than, anti-Semitic propaganda. Jews have always been called, various libels, and this is just one other effort, because as we've just said, Israel is one of the most pluralistic countries in the Middle East. It makes no difference that many Palestinians, in fact, have begged the BDS campaigners to stop promoting the boycott. Clearly, it's ineffective. The BDS is actually ineffective against Israel. Israel's economy is booming. Israel's trade is booming. In fact, I don't know. I wonder how it is that, for example, on university campuses, how it is they're going to promote BDS now that the United Arab Emirates is selling Israeli goods in its markets. I just saw a video this morning of Israeli goods in a UAE market. So how are they going to continue promoting BDS is going to be a central question. But the only damage that it has done is it actually to the Palestinians themselves, which is unfortunate because many Israeli companies have had to leave the West Bank and various territories. So the radical left-wing anti-Semitic movement is actually damaging the very people that it's purporting to stand up for. And so, for example, I want to leave you on this particular piece on the radical left-wing anti-Semitism, which is very dangerous. Yesterday, it was announced that an anti-Israel group is pushing a student referendum at Tufts University that promotes the discredited libel that Israel, and here's another libel, Israel trains US police forces to harm minorities. So as a consequence of the George Floyd, murder, what the radical left has tried to do was pin that murder in effect on Israel and on the Jewish people, and say that it's because Israelis train police officers, American police officers. And of course, this is not true. And this is another example of how it is that the radical left is trying to delegitimize the Jewish communities and Israel itself in the eye of the world. And this is why that IHRA definition that links Israel to anti-Semitism is so critical today. I want to talk to you about a second piece of modern contemporary anti-Semitism, which relates to this. The first part was about radical left. The second part, and for those of you, especially in France, you'll know violent Islamicism. Unfortunately, it's been a growing concern, and joining the war against the Jews and Israel are the Islamic fundamentalists. And I want to say that, of course, I don't generalize with any group. There are many amazing people of the Muslim faiths. Many of them are my friends, but unfortunately, we are still dealing with the Islamic fundamentalism who are advocating violence against the state of Israel. Perhaps for the very first time in history since Nazi Germany, today there is a state sponsor of anti-Semitism and terrorism, and we all know who that is. It's the Iranian regime. The Ayatollah, if you are on his Twitter site, you'll regularly see tweets where he's openly tweeting Holocaust denial. He's asking, did the Holocaust really happen? Why is it that we can't question the Holocaust, but we can question everything else? And of course, promoting the continuous narrative from the Iranian regime that it wants to wipe Israel off the map as it's developing a nuclear arsenal to do that. And so we're dealing with a, really the largest sponsor, state sponsor of anti-Semitism in the world is Iran today. And across the world, we've seen anti-Semitic events that are coming from that Islamic strain, including even here where I live in Toronto, in my city, and this is across the world because I know it happens yearly, especially when, we're out of Corona. It's an event called Al-Quds Day, which is, Al-Quds means Jerusalem. And it's this day was actually invented by the Ayatollah to mark the intent, the movement to evict the Jews from Jerusalem and return to Jerusalem. And so there is a radical event that happens in these cities. It's called Al-Quds Day, and it's virulently, I've been there, I've seen it, I've seen the placards. It's incredibly anti-Semitic, and it's aligned with terror organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. And even at the rallies, they hold up pictures of the Ayatollah. And this is one of the anti-Semitic events. And then going across to Europe, we know, of course, that the Jewish communities in France especially, but not exclusively. We know that in Germany as well, in England, but France, I have to say, is number one where Jews have been violently attacked. And this happens on a very regular basis. We can't forget what happened, as an example, at the hyper-kasher market just a few years ago. The sad stories of people like Ilan Halimi, who was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. And this one, and Sarah Halimi, a Holocaust survivor who was literally thrown off of her balcony by a Muslim attacker. And those are just, three examples. And we can sit here all day, and we know that schools and synagogues and, individuals have been attacked all over France. In Europe, we know that grave cemeteries, are desecrated on a weekly basis. And this is a tragedy, what is happening in Europe. French Jewish community, of course, many leaving, emigrating to Israel and to Canada and to America. And this is, it's really a disaster, what is going on with anti-Semitism in Europe. And we can talk about some statistics in a minute. And finally, I want to talk to you about the third strain of anti-Semitism in contemporary times very quickly, which would be the most obvious one. I started with the least obvious. And that third strain, of course, is the neo-Nazi white supremacist strain, which is interesting because there's a convergence between the radical left that I started talking about, the Islamic, and of course the radical right. And all three of these groups, I would presume, dislike one another. They would never talk to one another, but they have one common enemy, and that is the Jews. And promoting anti-Semitism is their bread and butter. And white supremacist, neo-Nazi Nazis have been around for many years in various incarnations. The ideology obviously comes from Nazism, and since then it has grown primarily in America. In recent years, it's become very, very organized. The FBI has recently put out statements saying that this is the most dangerous group or multiple groups in America today. We recall, of course, the Unite the Right rally that was held just a few years ago, actually, in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the white supremacists walked openly on the streets saying and yelling, "Jews will not replace us." And this, of course, since that happened, it unleashed a wave of white supremacist Nazi type of attacks on the Jewish community. Those attacks, of course, have included the horrific murder of worshipers at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, where 11 worshipers were murdered by violent white supremacists. Similarly, in 2019, again, a white supremacist gunman entered the Poway Synagogue and murdered one worshiper and injured an additional 3. And of course, we know his intent was to murder many more. And just a few weeks ago, the FBI said that it arrested the leader of a white supremacist group called the Base in Michigan. And this is the traditional framework. This particular group was running basically a hate camp in a farmhouse in Michigan. And there were connections also across the border to Canada. So what we're seeing in North America is the rising tide of this neo-Nazism, white supremacism. In fact, I'll tell you one side story if I have time. How am I doing for time, Marco?
Okay, you still have like 5 minutes.
Okay, good. So I'll tell you one side story here, not in my writing here, but I often take groups to visit concentration camps, and I take police chiefs. And so just a year ago, I took one of my groups to visit Auschwitz. And so they came back. So one of the police chiefs who is in a small town in Alberta, which is, a province in Canada. And he was very inspired by what he learned about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism. And so he came back and he started paying attention to what was going on in his own backyard. And so he called me up a few weeks later and he said, Avi, I have to tell you this, that, we found in our own backyard a white supremacist who was posting neo-Nazi materials in stores and flyers on posts, and he was trying to recruit for his neo-Nazi movement. So we dug a little bit deeper about this guy and we got a warrant to his house. And in his house, we searched his house, and in his house, we found 4 rifles, automatic rifles, 1,200 rounds of ammunition, and a whole bunch of anti-Semitic literature. And he said, look, this guy was a ticking bomb, and he was planning, he had actually written a manifesto, and we know that, most mass murderers like this actually write a manifesto. So the police chief told me that, this guy was ready to go. And so what we're dealing with when it comes to anti-Semitism and white supremacism is these guys, and there are potentially many of them, lying in wait and ready to go, who are acting as lone wolves and ready to strike the Jewish community, but also, as we know, even the Muslim community. I want to talk to you about some statistics if I still have a couple more minutes. So in 2019, the European Commission published a report on perceptions of anti-Semitism among Europeans. And only 36% of Europeans believed, like of the general population, that anti-Semitism had increased in the last 5 years. But interestingly enough, 89% of Jews believed that anti-Semitism is a problem. And in fact, 44% of young European Jewish people had actually experienced anti-Semitism. And 70% of them thought that the government doesn't do enough to combat anti-Semitism. And so what we're seeing actually, and this is the same thing in North America, as young people are feeling anti-Semitism more and more these days, especially online and on the internet. It's very, very common these days to see anti-Semitism on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter, and all of these social networking platforms. It's become almost second nature. The American Jewish community also experienced the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents last year. It reports about 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, and harassment across the United States. I think that number is actually low. Most anti-Semitic incidents are not reported, in fact. So these are just reported incidents. And the ADL itself issued today found that the total number of anti-Semitic incidents increased in 2019 by about 12%, with really what is most disturbing, 56% increase in actual assaults. And as we know, in New York, especially in the last year, there have been murders, anti-Semitic murders, assaults on subways, and assaults against the Orthodox Jewish community on the streets of New York. And that's been a very disconcerting impact. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, Community Security Trust also reports a 7% increase, or 1,805 incidents last year. France, the same thing. France reports in 2019 74% increase, a resurgence of anti-Semitism. So all around, I know that this is not new to any one of you on this call. There is a massive increase in anti-Semitism. And to summarize my presentation, and in closing, essentially the Jewish people are being squeezed in from three dominant sides: the radical left, which I believe is actually the most dangerous and the most problematic. We're talking about the radical left on one side, the Islamic fundamentalists who are, practicing violence, Islamic rallies like Al-Quds Day. And then, of course, the traditional anti-Semitism, which is coming from the neo-Nazi white supremacist groups. So those three are squeezing against the Jewish communities throughout the world, and this is cause for concern. So thank you very much for listening, and I will hand it over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Avi. I would like to ask Father Desbois to comment, and I have a very specific question that I would like to raise to Father Desbois and have his opinion, his theory about this, and it is: what has changed since the classic anti-Semitism in Europe during the early 30s, which allowed that the Holocaust could happen, killing millions of Jews all over Europe? What has changed since that, Father Desbois?
What has changed, the first, is that more than 6 million Jews have been shot or gassed from France to Azerbaijan. And so who could imagine, I would say, that 60 years after, 70 years after, we would be speaking of anti-Semitism after the worst genocide of the planet, the most radical one, when they never left a child in a village of Ukraine, a Jewish child alive. So I totally agree with what Avi said. On my side, I felt a big changement after 2005. I remember it was a strong commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. And we were in Auschwitz, but also a lot of movies, a lot of ceremonies with many chiefs of states and so on and so on. And me, with other people in Europe and mainly in France, we began to smell a strange smell. How I could say, and before that period, it was impossible nearly to say in a nice meeting that you didn't like the Jews, because you would be immediately accused to be a Nazi, a fascist, something like that. And suddenly, it became difficult, even for me in my responsibility in the church, to say I was working with the Jews, because you were immediately accused that it could not be clean and it could not be good, and also you were surely a hidden Zionist. And so I began to study and try to understand what was happening. I realized that the classic anti-Semite of Europe, who has always been anti-Semite, I think, before the war, during the war, after the war, didn't dare to say it. It was like a taboo, to be afraid to be accused. You remember when Mrs. Le Pen, Mr. Le Pen said something, all the TVs were around. But after 2005, they began to say, okay, we paid the bill now. It's far away. Okay, many ceremonies, everything. Now we are free. Finally, we are free to say we hate the Jews. And I saw in the best groups, I will give you an example. She's no more in charge, so it's easy. It was an official dinner of Le Crif, and it was the ambassador of Lithuania was there, seated near David Rothschild, Eric Rothschild. And Eric said, oh, it's Father Desbois, he works about Holocaust. And she said, oh, come to my embassy. I would be so happy to help you, Father, to work in Lithuania and so on. I went to the embassy and she yelled on the Jews during 45 minutes. She told me, if you meet the Jews in Lithuania, they will lie, they will not say you the truth. It was another voice. So I began to feel that when people were not in front of the Jews, it was so easy to say they didn't like the Jews. When they were with the Jews, no, it was not possible at the moment. Everybody was nice. And slowly but surely, this classic anti-Semitism, left and right, began to appear in a good society, I would say. What has changed for me a lot, it's the beginning of violence, of criminal anti-Semitism against Jews. I will never forget when they killed this young Jew in France. We could not believe. We could not believe a Jew could be killed in France because he was a Jew. We could not believe. A huge demonstration was in the street. I remember even Cardinal Lustiger was, for the first and the last time of his life, in a demonstration with all the government, with all the Jewish leaders, with all the opposition at the period. And I would tell you, we were thinking it would be the first and surely the last one. But suddenly we saw not always big crimes, but little injuries, synagogue burnt, synagogue damage, swastika on a door, yelling against Jews, against families, etc., etc. And after, other attacks. We see also that the people who attacked the Jews, of course, they are anti-Semite, but they are also criminals. Criminals. It's a mix of anti-Semitism and crime. And of course, it comes from, actually for France, mainly the radical Muslims connected to ISIS or to other groups, and also with a push from outside, from Syria, from Iraq, because I am there, I know music. And surely for me, it's a big changement, because it didn't happen only in France. It began to happen also in Germany, of course, also in Ukraine, etc. Where are Jews in Europe? What is complicated for me is that all these movements show themselves like movement of revolution to get Europe free of Jews, free of this domination. And this new appearance of revolution, Islamist revolution, ultra-left revolution, ultra-right revolution, it's not only the Jews who are the target. Sometimes it's many others, because we saw now many crimes committed about other people in Europe and also against the church. But I will never forget, I learned my Spanish, which is still not good, in Peru. It was in Cusco. For me, it was half learning Spanish, half taking rest. So I don't know if you know where is Cusco, but it's near Machu Picchu. It's a very beautiful place, full of tourists from everywhere. And suddenly, I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw the biggest demonstration against the Jews. I couldn't believe, because I was nearly in holidays. I said, come on, we're in Cusco. And I went to see, and they have published flyers, the worst flyers I never saw against the Jews. So I entered in the meeting. It was 700 indigenous people. So imagine these people have never seen a Jew in their life, of course, and will surely never see one. And the people who spoke to them, I don't know where they were from, but they were from Peru, but not indigenous. And they told them, the Jews are taking Peru today to enslave you like they have enslaved the Palestinians. So I say that because it's not only anti-Israel. It's also to say, no, you know what? You are a minority. You know what? You are poor. You know what? You feel exploited. There is one reason. There is one hidden group who is behind the screen, handling the planet, and this group has a name, the Jews. You know, we opened the first Holocaust museum in Central America, in Guatemala. You know, Guatemala is a nice country. Of course, there is violence, there is problem with earthquake, but it's a very beautiful country. And this museum is near the government, near the cathedral, in the very center of the city. And so it was the coronavirus blocus. And so Marco began to spread the teaching about Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Spanish. And we had surprisingly 1,000 people every time. So we're very surprised. That was the positive part. But the negative part is that we have the worst anti-Semite attacks against us, accusing us about everything, accusing the Jews about everything. And suddenly we saw Nazi symbols, the swastika on the door of a museum in Guatemala, you know. You know how many Jews are in Guatemala? You know how many Jews? It's a small community. And they are not handling the country, of course. So for me, what is complicated now is that the anti-Semite see them like the cleaners. They are cleaning the planet. They are just James Bond of the planet to deliver the planet from this group. And so it federates as well children from ISIS in Iraq and Syria, as well radical Muslims here who also don't know the Jews, but think if they kick a Jew physically, I mean physically, because I am concentrated of criminal anti-Semitism. If they kick a Jew, they will deliver Europe from the Jews who are handling the country. And there is a common strategy between the anti-Semite. They want the Jew to leave, to go away from France, like they went away from Poland, like they have to go away from Palestine, go away. And so what is complicated for the young leaders, I work mainly with young people, I'm a professor in Georgetown, I work also with a group of young leaders in France, is not easy because either they open their eyes, also on the Christian side, and they see the big problem with happening. Either they close their eyes and they take the life to go to the sea, to have a beautiful life, and to forget everything. So it needs lucidity and not to be paranoid, to know really who are the groups in our country who are working hard against the Jews, but sometimes not only against the Jews, because the government told us actually there is a rise of violence against the Jews, the Gypsies, and the gay in the same country. And so even when the government told me that, I say, it remembers me something. The Jews first, Gypsies again, the gay, it remembers me something. I say that because I think slowly but surely, even if it comes from Islamists, even if it comes from ultra-left, ultra-right, or perhaps for people who have no opinion, the fact that they begin to be criminal, that it must be taken very seriously. And thanks God, I would say in Europe, we have police, we have government, we have intelligence who are working hard to support the leaders to try, but we'll never be able to have one policeman per Jew and one policeman per Christian, because also we have many attacks against Christians now, and it's not because of Israel. So don't forget also that on the Islamist side, many of these young people have no knowledge about anybody except themselves. So they have an ideology that to stay among themselves and to eject anybody who is living in the middle. I'm not sure that tomorrow will be better. For me, it's not a lack of explanation, But we have surely to train leaders, young leaders, Jews and non-Jews, Jews, Christian, not Christian, whatever, will handle the society tomorrow against these people, because on their side, they are young. Don't forget the age of the killers in France. Everybody was young, and not only young but ready to die. Koulibaly was ready to die. Mohamed Merah was ready to die. But also the two guys who killed the priest was ready to die. And the guy in Nice who killed the people in the church was ready to die. I say that because we have, and in one way, to see the specificity of the criminal, the anti-Semite criminals, but also not to forget that they are actually among a bigger group of criminals who are popping here and there. What is new is surely that violence is not new, because don't forget how it began in Germany and in other countries. What is new, it's also the social media. Today, it's enough somebody send a fatwa in Malaysia or anywhere, and that a young guy listens to that in his country, and he applies the fatwa. So we are confronted to something also that we don't know, that we are not used, that the regular European doesn't even understand, doesn't know what is a fatwa, doesn't know what is a Sharia, doesn't know why there is a shooting in a synagogue and why they make a beheading on a professor. There is no connection. There is a connection. So it's not easy. We have not to dream, but we have to be optimistic. Because I think, don't forget, after Holocaust, what we have succeeded to build as society. But we must wake up all together, not only Jews, because the attack, if you go, I give you an example. Me, I work in Iraq, and we work with children who have been trained as terrorists. Yazidi, I'm not even Muslim. And so they have 1.5 years of Islamic school, special school, of course, and after they have a test. And the test was to know by heart the list of the people it's legal to kill by country and by religion. By country, of course, it begins by America. By religion, of course, it begins by the Jews, but the Christian are just at the second line. And don't forget that a young from ISIS or from Al-Qaeda today is against many people that he wants to eradicate because they are not believers. So I think we have to federate the people who accept not to sleep well, and to train young leaders who are courageous enough to stand and to see how to federate with themselves with leaders from other groups. We must agree to federate our fight with people we are not used to fight with. Because if we fight alone, it's lost. It's lost because on the other side, they don't care. If they shoot in a synagogue, they can shoot in a church tomorrow. For them, it's the same deal. Same deal, kufar, not believer, non-believer for the Muslim because they occupy Palestine, not believer for the Christian because they are behind the bombings of the coalition. It's the same. So I would say that either in America, that I know also now because of Georgetown, either in here, the best challenge for me is to train young people wherever they are from, because tomorrow, we need young people who don't dream, who don't sleep well, who are fighting together. Because on the other side, they are young. Don't forget that the Islamists believe in young people. They train young people, and they are ready to sacrifice young people. So on our side, we need to do the same, not to sacrifice them, but to train them. Otherwise, where are we going? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Marco, can I just say one thing?
Of course, please.
I think what Father Desbois said was very inspiring, and you know, I think one of the messages is true, that, you know, and you look at what's happened in France, you know, the attacks on the Jews, and now the attacks on everyone else, and they say, you know, what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. And therefore, you know, really what we're dealing with civilization. And we have to make sure that together, no matter who we are, no matter what faith we come from, You know, we have these shared values, and we have to confront it together, and that's what's important. And so it was shocking to see that a teacher was beheaded in Paris. I mean, it's actually unbelievable, and it's outrageous, and it makes me really upset. And so we have to confront this together, because it doesn't end with one group ever. So that's my response.
Thank you very much, Avi. Michał.
Yes, I think we have a question from Alessandro Mata.
Yes, any observation? The chat in Zoom is disabled. It is impossible to type questions in the chat. We have written also in Facebook this, please. And I put my question by voice to Dr. Benlolo. Dr. Benlolo, you talked about the social networks and anti-Semitism, negationism in social networks. And I want to ask you, what do you think about the so-called Holocaust challenges on TikTok? It is an example of distortion of the Holocaust. It is an example dangerous of also of negationism of the Holocaust for you. And also for Father Desbois, what do you think about this, about the TikTok challenges of on the Holocaust challenge on TikTok? Because the discussion is very, very open. Because for someone is not an example of distortion, is a modality for the young people to remember certain histories of the Holocaust. And what do you think about this? Thank you.
Well, firstly, I mean, you know, TikTok has been a major problem with respect to Holocaust distortion, denial, and as we know, with modern day forms, social networking, it could be used for positive and it could be used for negative. You know, the trains that carry Jews to Auschwitz, you know, they were not invented to carry Jews to Auschwitz. The trains were invented to transport people and goods and improve the world. Unfortunately, they were used in the mass murder of Jews. And so here we have a situation where technology, of course, in our modern day age could be used for good and could be used for bad. In this case, it's being used for both. So on one hand, I've seen on TikTok and on other social platforms where, you know, you have actually educational platforms, such as the story of Anne Frank that was produced by an Israeli. And therefore that story was there to educate the next generation, because here's the truth. The truth is that young people today are not reading as much. They're not seeing television or documentaries as much. And so they're exposed to what it is that they're seeing on these platforms. I've got, you know, young daughters who are using the platform actually, you know, a lot more recently. And so this could be a great format for those of us who are in education to utilize it in order to educate and reach these young minds with the important message and the truth. Conversely, the other side, the evil, let's call it the evil dark side, you know, those who would operate the trains to send the Jews to Auschwitz, they could be using them, you know, whereas the white supremacist ones would put up flyers in front of schools or would hand out flyers. Today, all they have to do is use Facebook and TikTok and Twitter and Instagram and so forth to recruit people. And so I've seen many of these examples and these distortions where you have young teenagers, unbelievable actually, young teenagers dressed with makeup, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, you know, as if they're concentration camp prisoners. It's outrageous. It's some people have called it Holocaust pornography, because it's so disgusting and disturbing that young people would mimic concentration camp prisoners in, just to be on TikTok and to get more followers. That's the whole purpose. And so this is a problem. This shows a lack of education, a lack of awareness, a lack of compassion, a lack of kindness and sympathy to the Holocaust, and not just the Holocaust, to all forms of genocide. Whether it's the Yazidis or the Rwandans, it really shows a lack of personal integrity from the young generation today. And so we as educators have to really, really think about this carefully, because there's a whole slew of young people today who are being exposed to distortion and Holocaust denial that is beyond comprehension. Now, I just want to add one more thing to that because of the outrage of the protests of, the Jewish communities and other peoples, to what is happening with these social networking platforms. All of these platforms actually just in the last 6 months have passed policies, if you go onto their websites, policies against hate speech and hate language, and specifically, Holocaust denial. For the first time, Mark Zuckerberg, who's a Jewish person himself, for years we were telling him, for years we were saying, listen, you got to get rid of the Holocaust denial on Facebook. And he said, no, free speech, which is what I was saying before, free speech. And we said, no, this is not free speech. You can't allow this. So for the first time, he's now, agreed. He put in a personal message to have a policy against Holocaust denial and distortion and anti-Semitism. TikTok as well has just in the last few months, set a policy against racism and anti-Semitism, as has Twitter and Instagram. And that's great news. It's positive because now they have moderators who are taking this stuff down. But we have to, as educators, we have to be stronger and try to use, so to speak, I'm using this metaphorically, use the train for positive ends, and use the technology for us to get to young people as fast and as much as possible to educate them in a positive way rather than this negative way. Hopefully that answers your question.
For me, I would say I teach since 7 years in Georgetown. I see a complete difference after 7 years. The new generation who arrives, so they are 20 years old, so they are born in 2000. It means Holocaust was 50 years before they are being born. So it's no more the story of grandpa, but of grandpa most of the time. And they know nearly nothing. Even sometimes the Jews, they know nearly nothing. So we must also understand when it passes to the memory of grandpa, you lose the compassion. You lose the fact to feel from this generation. Me, by example, my grandpa, one of my grandpa has been killed in the First World War. And I wouldn't say sadly, but nobody paid attention now to him. So I think also if we don't teach Holocaust in another way, look, by example, they were selling a uniform of Anne Frank on eBay for Halloween. And we have many, many examples like that they sell toys and things, and also people want a selfie in front of our My Fry or in the Juden ramp in Auschwitz. So even if they go to Auschwitz, it doesn't mean they will feel compassion with the Jews. They will feel like the host, like in the castle of Dracula, the worst place of the planet. They saw it, it was awful. That's it. And I want a picture of me. I want a selfie. You have also many young people who want to make a selfie on the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. Berlin is not an anonymous city for Holocaust. So I think if we don't teach Holocaust in another way, they are not ready to swallow the big story of Himmler, Heydrich, and that it feels for them far away, like Middle Age. And so I took on my side, and Yarad too, to teach the crime per crime, because we know what is a crime today. And I think if they see that to learn Holocaust is a way to heal the planet today, not only about anti-Semitism, but about hate in general and crimes in general, that it be useful. But otherwise, I'm afraid it will go back to a Jewish memory. And even for many young Jews say, okay, we are sick of that. We are young. We want to make our life. I know it's the story of grandpa, grandpa. I know, but I want to have a nice life. And I hear many young people like that. But on the other side, on the side of the enemies, the legacy of Hitler begins to be stronger. Same thing, before it was difficult to publish a book about Hitler. Now we find books about him everywhere, and in Arab world more. And I made conferences everywhere. I never had to introduce Hitler. They don't know Stalin, they don't know Mao, they don't know Pol Pot, they know Hitler. He's a brand. He's a brand of the mass killers. He's a name. He succeeded to make his name in the planet. And so we have a distortion about the killers or the enemies who are related to Hitler and love Hitler and are sad he didn't finish the job. And on the other side, young generation, we begin to feel far, 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 far. So we have also to turn our presentation of Holocaust so that young people feel what, because we have this question, what can I do today with that? What can I do today? And 75% of my students are not Jew. And most of them decide to enter in big NGO or in FBI or American organization like that. So I think, well, again, we have to be realistic. I'm not surprised of TikTok. I think we will have many, many stories like that. When you are finished with one, it will be another one. Because people feel it's like a story of Middle Age. Like you see a movie about the Crusades. And you will not say, oh, I am against the Crusade. No, it's far away. And I think year after year, you imagine for a young person who is born now, he will never see a survivor. Never, never. When he will be 10 years old, 15 years old, no more survivor. So it has changed. We are not in the same situation. We cannot teach Holocaust that we were teaching before. And so it's also a provocation for us. But I feel, because I go to Auschwitz with groups, and sometimes we see other groups and they joke and they smile and they eat sandwich and chewing gum and whatever. And of course, in Auschwitz also, you never name a German and a Jew during the visit. You never know where was this German working and was this Jew dying, except Father Kolb. So we are really to turn the wheel, otherwise we'll be surprised that the legacy about Holocaust outside of the Jews will be like a drop in the sea, because it's far away. So I say that because when you succeed to sell your uniform of Anne Frank on eBay, it means people don't feel anything. Otherwise, it would be stopped. It has been stopped, but it has been done.
Thank you very much, Father Desbois. Thank you very much. Avi, I'm sorry to be the bad cop, but our speakers of today have also other engagements for today. Thank you again to both of you for such an enlightening discussions, and we of course are aware that there is still much to do in this field. So thank you to all for your time. The next conference of the Beyond Memory program will be on next Wednesday, on December 2nd, and will be given by Dr. Edvard Westerman. He will talk about the role of the alcohol during the Holocaust. He will analyze how the consumption of alcohol became a routine for the soldiers in camps, in ghettos, in killing fields, especially in Eastern Europe. So I invite you to follow our social networks, Yahad's Facebooks and other social networks, to be updated about the next conference. And also we will send you an email with the link to register for the next conference. So thank you again, Father Desbois. Thank you again, Avi, for your time and for this fascinating presentations. And we wish you all a very nice day or evening.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated. Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.